Hey everyone, today I'm going to talk about George Washington and John Adams' presidencies and the key events that happened during their times in office. So let's start with George Washington, the first president of the United States. George Washington was the type of person who didn't actually want to have the power of the presidency, which I think is really important to have as the first person or as president, because he established a lot of precedents that weren't super planned for, so like tradition. So for example, like creating the cabinet was one of them, a cabinet of advisors. The fact that he decided to step down after 2 terms was another. So he could have kept going. He could have been in power for a lot longer if he wanted, because he was that popular. But he decided to step away from office, which I think is an important precedent to set early on that a lot of people follow after that. It's not until FDR do we get somebody serving more than those 2 terms, and then it eventually becomes a law. But Washington did have a few problems that he had to deal with. The first problem was the French Revolution that occurred during his first term in office. The Enlightenment ideas of democracy spread to France around this time, and the French people began to revolt. Americans were very supportive of this. They felt it was like the second part of their own revolution, and when France and Great Britain go to war, the US had to decide if they would support the French or not, because they still felt like those ideas were important to support. And we actually still had an alliance with the French that was created during the Revolutionary War in 1778 called the Franco-American Alliance. So there was some ideas and some Americans who wanted to go support France because they had helped us during the war and they had just gone through a revolution upholding similar ideas like ours. But Washington decided the country was still too young to get involved, and so he issued something called the Proclamation of Neutrality in 1793. People like the Jeffersonians who supported the French were not happy, but people who supported the British felt a little bit better. Washington also had to deal with issues with Great Britain. After the Revolutionary War, they were supposed to remove their troops from the forts in the West, but they didn't. And then, thinking that Americans would join the French during the war, they began to attack some American merchant ships and force American sailors into their navy or throw them in the dungeons. So some Americans wanted to go to war against the British again, but Washington decided to keep neutrality and instead sent somebody named John Jay to talk to the British to find a solution. John Jay came back with a treaty called Jay's Treaty, and it was horrible. It was not good at all. The British promised to remove their troops from the forts in the West, but they had already promised this before, so there were no assurances that this would happen. In fact, they had already promised this to John Jay himself, even. So there's no proof that this is going to happen. They promised to pay damages to the ships that were seized, but they didn't actually say they would stop doing it in the future. And on top of these bad terms, he also promised that the United States would pay any debts they owed before the Revolutionary War. So people were not happy about that, especially in the South, because they owed more money. But the people in the North who relied on shipping and trade with England were feeling a little bit better because that would fix relations with England a little bit more. One good thing that did come out of this, though, is that Spain saw all of this happen and were afraid that the Americans were going to have an alliance with Britain, so they decided to create a deal with the United States. And this is called Pinckney's Treaty. And in this treaty, Americans gained everything they really wanted, which was free access to the Mississippi River so they could trade and a lot of land north of Florida. The last issue I want to discuss is the Whiskey Rebellion. And I mentioned this in the Articles of Confederation video earlier. This is the rebellion that proves the Constitution is strong and working in comparison to Shays' Rebellion, which proves that the Articles of Confederation were really weak. In 1794, some people in Pennsylvania began to rebel against the whiskey tax that Hamilton brought about to help pay for the debt the government had taken on. In response, he gathered together the militia from several states and led them to march to Pennsylvania to stop the rebellion. It ended very quickly with only 3 deaths. Most importantly, it showed that the new national government was strong. Again, if you're asked about this on the test, and you should compare it with Shays' Rebellion, proving the Articles of Confederation were weak. After these issues, Washington decided that he was done and stepped down after 2 terms. He wrote a farewell address, and it was printed in the newspapers. This is an address you could potentially see in a document where he warned the people about a couple things like permanent alliances and political parties and sectionalism and the the problems that would cause. So these are all things we're going to discuss later in American history. So he did a pretty good prediction on some problems the country was going to face. Okay, let's talk about John Adams' administration now. So after Jay's Treaty, the French were angry and felt like the United States went behind their back and basically formed an alliance with the British, who they were at war with. So they began to attack U.S. merchant ships. Adams sent representatives to France to talk about this issue, and before they were even allowed to talk to the French representative, they were approached 3 different times trying to get them to pay a bribe that would allow them to see the representative. The Americans refused to pay the bribe and considered this an insult, and this became known as the XYZ affair. In return, Adams stopped trade with France and allowed American ships to attack and capture French ships. But this wasn't an officially declared war. It was just fought on the seas. And this is why it's called the quasi-war. Quasi is a word that means almost but not all the way. So it was almost a full war, but not quite. The quasi-war ended in 1800 when Adams was willing to send a representative again to negotiate peace with France. They were successful and a full-scale war was avoided, which probably wouldn't have been great at the time. But during this time, the Federalists used the anti-France hatred to pass some laws in their favor. They specifically wanted to hinder the Jeffersonian Republicans from gaining more power. So they passed something called the Alien and Sedition Acts. This made it harder for new immigrants, or aliens, to become citizens, because immigrants who came to America were more likely to support the Jeffersonian Republicans, and so this would help keep the Federalists in power. And the Sedition Act made it illegal to defame government officials, including the president. If they did make false accusations, then they could be fined or imprisoned. And this was a violation of the freedom of speech that was passed in the Bill of Rights, and Jeffersonians hated it. Jefferson and Madison decided to respond to the Alien and Sedition Acts with something called the Virginia and Kentucky Resolutions. And I have seen these on the test before in the form of multiple choice questions or even in the form of a short answer question. It could also be a DBQ prompt or a DBQ document, so just be familiar with the concept of these ideas. So the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions were something that were written in secret so they wouldn't be arrested. We know now that it was by Jefferson and Madison. And in the documents, they called for a nullification of the Alien and Sedition Acts because they were a violation of the people's rights and broke the contract the states had created by forming the central government in the first place. This idea was actually later used by Southerners when they wanted to support nullification of the Tariff of Abominations, and then later when they seceded from the Union before the Civil War. So this idea of nullification or trying to cancel the law influenced someone like John C. Calhoun later. But Jefferson and Madison didn't want to leave the country at this time. They just wanted the law to change, and they were trying to fix the Alien and Sedition Acts. This conflict over the Alien and Sedition Act led directly into the election of 1800, where we have a battle between the Federalists who supported Adams and the Democratic Republicans who supported Jefferson. And in 1800, Thomas Jefferson becomes president, which we will talk about at a later time. So there haven't been a lot of written response questions about Washington and Adams and their presidencies. You might see some of their documents. There'll definitely be some in the multiple choice questions. So this time I decided, instead of giving you a practice SAQ or practice DBQ or LEQ prompt, I'm going to leave you with a multiple choice question this time. Take some time to read through it, check, and then when you're done, check the answer in the description below. And I'm going to leave you today with the wise words of Ron Weasley, because I'm sure you're tired of studying, even though this is only Unit 3. We've got a ways to go, but the payoff will be worth it. I know it. So in the wise words of Ron Weasley, don't let the muggles get you down.